Welcome back. Okay, hopefully you have watched the TED Talk, you've watched those 3 short videos, and you've read the article about if, then, and text, and now you're ready to look at what we're going to do for this week's short, kind of very small assignment before you go and launch into the midterm. So I'm going to share my screen and show you how I used some of what that gal was talking about in those explainer videos. So I went to, and I won't show you exactly how I did it. I was trying to go back and forth, and I thought this was probably just as easy because you've watched her video, so you know the step-by-step. So I just went to this executive summary, and I thought, you know, what might be an interesting thing, let me see if this tells a useful story, is I'm going to do a pie chart here. Again, I would make this a lot prettier if I were presenting it to a client, but we're just experimenting right now. We're just getting in the water, get in the water and get used to this. That's all we're doing. We will get pretty by week 7. So just make sure you're experimenting here. And I thought, well, let's see, what does it look like if I try to do a revenue breakdown and see what that looks like in my pie. So I did exactly what the gal said. I selected this, then I went up to insert, then I picked the little pie, and then I clicked OK, and that popped up. And then I did the same thing for my expenses, because it's one thing to see where the revenue is coming. Let's see if the expenses would have been wildly different as a pie chart. That would have told a cool story, right? I could have been like, oh my gosh, what if the revenue is all coming from this one place, but the expenses for that particular color were really small? Ooh, now that would be a good use of 2 pie charts. I could use that in a PowerPoint and tell a compelling story. But I did it and I was like, oh, it doesn't tell a very compelling story at all. In fact, it's kind of what you would expect, which is a bummer, because the revenue for the certain pieces kind of mapped up with what the expenses were. Now, obviously, we know it's higher. The revenue was higher because we came out in the black and we got 29% gross profit, but it's not that useful of visuals. It's like, meh, So I took a page from her book where she said to do this little point explosion, which I thought was cool. I'd done other things before, but I hadn't heard it called a point explosion. So I selected this little piece, which is the pods or the regional satellites, because I thought, well, this is interesting. How come we get all this revenue, but we got a teeny little slice of expenses? And I looked over here and I was like, oh yeah, you're right. We're making $250,000 and we're only spending 40. Well, damn. I mean, if that was the only thing we do, that's a pretty darn good profit margin. So there's an argument that maybe if we shrunk our in-person a little bit, focused more on this, look at those slices in comparison to each other. Now, it's not the best pictorial way, I think, to describe it, but I tried a bar graph because, again, you want to try what tells the best story with the numbers that you have. And let's say my whole goal was to tell this client, or at least test my hypothesis, that they should be doing more regional satellites. Well, that's okay. And I thought, well, I wonder what it looks like if I do a bar graph. So did exactly what the gal in the little video said, and I selected all of this, and then I went up to insert, and then I went over to the bar graph, and then I clicked that, and then up popped my bar graph for revenue and expenses. Not that compelling. I mean, if I showed somebody this, they'd be like, what's the point? So in a sense, even though my pie chart isn't that awesome, it is better than my bar graph, because my bar graph is just kind of meaningless sitting there unless there was some sort of more interesting way of presenting it. So I'd probably get rid of the bar graph. I might keep the pie chart, but I'd only keep the pie chart if I really plucked out the part that is a compelling story, which I think are those regional satellite events being extremely positive on the revenue side and a very minimal on the cost side. And that's where I would explode those pieces out to make that visual story more compelling. It's an idea. Again, we're just playing. I agree that's not the biggest thing we're going to see here, but it would be much better if, let's say, even that revenue was bigger, the expense was smaller, and let's say the other expenses were a little more all over the place, we could make an even more compelling argument. But still, it's good to see pie chart here on its own, not that interesting. Revenue versus expensive, still not that interesting. Pulling it out, a little more interesting. Bar graph, useless for this particular thing. So then I went over to my historical and projections, and I really wanted to look at projections. And I thought, well, what if I changed, just for sake of argument, and I would recommend you do this. You can use mine. Again, as I said in the intro lecture, anytime you use mine, it's going to be a little harder to get your head around because we're just kind of using this. It's almost like using an old car in the garage that's been a little pieced together. If you build your own shiny new car, you'll know how to work it a little better. But let's say you use my kind of old car. I would just change, for sake of argument, what if we had done, and I didn't take the time to go through these columns, but what if we had done instead, which is what we'll want to do eventually as we're projecting into the future, that column G was year 1 of this event that we're going to do. And that's going to be like 2023 or something. And then year 2 and year 3, and we're trying to see what would happen over time. Now, obviously, we would have to change a lot of factors on our different tabs and maybe create a tab for year 1 in person, or, or different columns on in person for year 1, year 2, year 3, start to build that story. And same with virtual, year 1, year 2, 3, pod, year 1, year 2, 3, subscriptions. I mean, you'd have to build out all those different data sets to then roll up into this, right? Following me? So you would have to build that different years and projecting how much you'd make every year. You could choose if you wanted a different tab for those, or if you kept one tab, which would be the way I would do it, and do multiple columns. So you're starting to see maybe how you're increasing over time for that event, both in revenue and in expenses. So for sake of argument, in a quick way of using an old car, all I did was change G3, H3, and I3 to year 1, 2, and 3. I didn't do any of the hard work throughout the tabs. So that's all I did. You can do that too. If you want to just use this as a simple experiment, maybe you got a hard week ahead, totally fine. If you're feeling like, nope, I can kind of get ahead of the game, then I would recommend maybe building out in your in-person, virtual, whatever kind of revenue streams you're eventually going to use for that final presentation. Start to build out different ways that you can see years, so you could build a trend line and a recommendation. But for now, year 1, year 2, year 3. Then I just went down here and thought, I'm going to put my trend line on this tab, makes sense for me. And I'm going to call it revenue over time, year. And then what do? I always use formulas. I always do links. You will not see me type a number once I get my financial model built. If you saw me type a number there, you would know I'm about to mess myself up. So I just did an equals to this, pulled this data down there. And then for expenses, what do? I'm going right to my equals G3 G11 and G10, not typing any numbers, just doing linking. Revenue, same thing. And I did year 2. Again, I'm just calling these year 2, year 1, 2, 3. And then I got that. Then I was like, okay, well, let's compare if these really were year 1, 2, and 3. We know I based it originally on attendees, but if I did that, what would that look like? So then I did exactly what she said. I selected all my data, just like she said in that little video. I did an insert. I went over to the little lines, bloop, right there, and I clicked OK, and my little thing popped up. I titled it. And the only thing that was tricky for me, it might be for you, I don't know what level of Excel you have, is I had to click on this little part down here, the legend. I had to double click it, and then I had to go to select data. See, and it really was tricky for me. I don't know why it was not happy with the way that she had it, and it's different than before. Anyway, it took me a bit. Select data. That's what I finally went to. So I did a right click, select data, and then I was able to change these names here, and I did name, and I typed the name there. That was tricky. So I went to the bottom, I right clicked, I got select data. I went over here and it said series 1, and instead I went over to the name and I just typed expenses. I didn't even type that equals quotes expenses. And then I did okay. And it finally came up, because you need to know which one's expenses and which one's revenue, or that would make not much sense. So a very simple trend line, and it tells a good story. Because if I said, hey, this is my recommendation, if we do this combination of events in year 1, this combination in year 2, and this combination in year 3, look at that. We're going to really start to overcome our expenses. We're going to have a nice trend line going up, and maybe that delta, which is right now is 29% gross profit, is great. So, and maybe we're going to expand that over time. Maybe by year 4 and 5, that even becomes bigger. My revenue higher, my expenses maybe staying more consistent. But that's a great use of a trend line. You know, revenue and expenses over time makes so much sense to show an executive. Well, it makes sense to show an executive unless it's going down, expenses are going up and revenue is going down. But still, that would tell you a story that maybe that's the wrong course of action. And if an executive is making you do something and you feel like that's what's happening, the revenue is going to go down, expenses are going to go up, then that could be a really useful trend line to show them and go, I don't think we're headed in the right direction. And here's my recommendation that gets our trend line to go here. So that is how you'd want to use a trend line. Now, the other things that you could use a trend line for are how your audiences are changing over time. Like maybe in this revenue key, if you had year 1, 2, and 3, and maybe you broke out a different, you know, I would then copy and paste different columns of these categories, right? I would make this a lot longer and put year 1, here's my categories, breakdown and ticket prices. Year 2, categories, percentage, ticket prices. Year 3, you know, so it'd be a lot longer. This is where financial models get really, you have to build this whole thing. But once you do, my friend, you'll be very, very, very happy, because then you could start to tweak year 1, 2, and 3 with these percentages and see that maybe if you're corporate, maybe it starts at 35, but you want to get it to 50. And you show, if we get our corporate attendees to be 50% by year 3, we're making $1 million more. Really? Well, now if you said, and all we'd have to do is do my VIP dinner program. Well, hell, do your VIP dinner program. That's a great idea. So this is how you'd use this to show over time what might change in revenue and expenses. And then you'd have to see what your expenses were for your VIP dinner to make sure that that wouldn't, you know, take away from your margin. Another thing that you could do on this tab if you wanted to, again, all you'll have to do this week when you see it is create one pie chart, one bar graph, one trend line. Very easy. That's it. Just 3. That's it. The other thing you could do on this tab, there'd be great use of a pie chart, is a percentage of attendees. You know, how much percentage of attendees do we have right now? And then if you did do, let's say for your final project, you wanted to show how that would change over time, the percentages, maybe again, 35% year 1, maybe it goes 40% for corporate year 2, 50% for corporate year 3, showing those 3 different pie charts could be really interesting, and especially mapped against revenue pie charts, because maybe at the beginning, there's not really a story. Maybe by the second pie charts, you know, if we change the percentage here and dial it, ooh, look what happens to the revenue here. And we dial it the last, ooh, crazy, that's awesome. So that could be a really great way of showing it. The other interesting trend line you could show is virtual attendees over time. You know, maybe you start it here and you think the virtual attendees are going to skyrocket or hockey stick, as they say. That'd be interesting for a trend line on its own, especially if it's compared with in person. Maybe in person is barely going up and virtual hockey sticks. Interesting. You know, now if it's paired with revenue, which you'd want to know, then maybe that makes a compelling case or story. But I'm hoping you can see how using pictures, if they make sense, and you saw how my bar graphs did not make sense. You didn't get anything from that. So if you use visualizations and they make sense and they tell a story, they are a very, very useful tool in your arsenal. It's not about learning how to do them. That's the easy part. That's just learning how to hammer. What's more important is where and why and when you hammer. So that is the harder part of, let's say, being a carpenter. And it's the same here. And I only want you to put these visuals on either the executive summary There's plenty you could play with there. Plenty of information, interesting things you could do with data there. Historical projections, plenty of interesting information, and you could change any of the tops, year 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't care what you do. It's about understanding why you'd put something there and what you could put there. Or your revenue key, which has revenue and attendees. This is just rich. It has revenue, it has attendees, it has event type, it has percentage of attendees. You could spend all your time here and do all 3 here if you wanted to. We just want 3 visuals, 1 of each, and then make it make sense. So it wouldn't be a bar chart like I just showed. It would have to give you useful data, like, pulling out a little picture of a pie piece that says this is interesting. And just keep them on those first 3 tabs, because there's not really a reason to put them on the other tabs. I mean, you could make an argument for it, but let's keep it simple for now. Just one of those 3 tabs, do 1 visual of each, pie chart, bar graph, trend line. That's it. Okay, and then I'm going to give you a quick kind of preview into what we're doing next week, which is about risk. So this week, we're just going to start to think about risk a little bit, learning about data visualization. We don't need one more thing, right? So this is really just a preview, just to give you a hint, because next week, it's all about protecting our precious revenue. We've learned how to build, we've learned how to create, we've been creative, we've been thinking about how large we can make our pie, how big we could be. And now we have to think about, well, realism and what would potentially be coming for our revenue to take it away from us. How might we need to mitigate it, insure against it, prepare for it, and create contingencies. That's all next week. So for this week, the only thing I think might be interesting for you to see, and that's why I have a if-then video for that type of a formula and an if-then text article, because this is just the way I quantify my risk, and it makes it easy for me. You may or may not like this particular way of doing it, and you can do it manually. I don't recommend that, but if you have a teeny tiny financial model, maybe that makes more sense. If you've got a massive model and you really need to kind of track and tell the story of risk, this might come in handy, or you might alter it a little bit. So do you need to learn this like the back of your hand? Not necessarily, but maybe at least get the concept now, and we'll cover it more next week. This is not graded or assigned this week. I created on my little financial model here a tab called risk. Yeesh. And it's really risk categories and ranges. So maybe I'll put that in here, because that makes more sense. Because I want to see what kind of range do we have with the things that I think are probably a big risk this year. And so what I did is I did this cool if-then formula right there. And I did if on the 2022 line item in-person budget. That is a budget. There's an X in this column, then put risk on my sheet, and otherwise put NA. So that was my first if then. I just wanted to know, okay, pull that over, because then I said in this next column, well, if this thing over here equals risks, then pull over the financial number that's associated with that line item. So I have a risk number in the amount of 444,000. Yeesh. And then I was like, well, if there's risk there, I also want you to tell me what category it's in. So it's in production. Ooh. And then I gave myself a range column, because then I could think, ooh, if production is costing that, and I think it's a big risk category, now I am going to put in a number. You wouldn't have to. You could create a percentage over here of how much you think that might go up. And then you could multiply it. That would give you the ability to play with those percentages. What does this mean? Well, over here in my line item, I just created a category called a column, high risk category. And then I went through and I did this randomly again. I'm using this as an example. And I was like, well, I'm going to put an X for production, because I know as I was building this, that this is a huge risk, because labor is exploding over in this country. And I think it's going to go haywire. I don't know where it's going to go, but I think it might go higher it has the potential to go higher than where it is right now. I'm putting in a realistic number, but I want to alert my client that this is a category that could have some expansion in case they want to put more contingency in their overall budget. So I put an X there, and let's say over at staff, I put another X, and broadcast room. Yeah, who knows why I thought that was a big deal, but special event. Yeah, there could be, a VIP coming. And then I just went down and I just put some random X's, right? So when I was building my budget, if I did that as I was building the budget, so I didn't have to remember it. Like I didn't want to have memory of like, ooh, which things am I worried about? Which things have I heard or read in the newspapers or somewhere else? What's going to go crazy? I didn't want to have to remember it. I just put those X's, and maybe I would go back at some point and be like, geez, I just heard about supply chain. If that had just popped up, and I might put an X on where we might have been ordering swag from overseas. Then if I built this tab called risk, I don't have to do anything at all because it's all doing it automatically. That's what's great about a model. I would just have to go back in here, click the X's, go over to my risk column and go, I wonder what that equaled. And then I would also put a total down here. So let's just do in person. And I'm just going to do, that's going to be a total. Whoop. And that's going to be a total. That I'm not going to worry about. That I'm not going to worry about. And then I would just do equal sum. And again, this would all update based on what I'm putting in here. Let me do this. And I should have gone all the way to the bottom. I knew. But let's say I put the range there and I think, you know what? It could go up $100,000. And then this, I think, could go up to 225, go up 50K. This, I think, could go all the way up to 100. I need to prepare them for that. This could go up to 100. So in a sense, equals minus, I could say, hey, if you want to be real cautious, I'm going to recommend, and right now I'm in D26. I've been seeing our risk categories are starting to climb, and based on my reading of all this evidence and things coming in, I think you might want to put aside 175,000 of extra contingency for these particular risk categories. That is a really nice way for me that I do my categories of risk. So it does take some formula work and setting it all up ahead of time, but you can see how this saves time, and it also makes a compelling argument if you have to argue for more contingency based on risk. So that's just a little kind of extra bonus thing to throw in your toolkit. If you'd want to use this, if you decide to do it manually, that's up to you. I will be asking you in the final presentation to quantify what categories of risk you see and how much additional contingency you think you'd recommend for your client or organization that you're in. Makes it easy if you do it like this, but you could stick with manual. So just keep that in mind. I do a column, first step on my in-person for X's. Then I create an if. There's an X, put risk or not applicable. Then I do over here, if that says risk, put the financial number that it's associated with. I don't put anything in the range, anything yellow. I know I'm actually typing numbers in, so I alert my head to that. I also do an if then. Hey, if that says risk, pull over the title of that category. I could just multiply this by a percentage if I really felt the need to. And then I do totals at the bottom. So that's a little bonus round for those of you who are feeling like you want to move forward and do that. But it's just a good way of knowing, or at least now you know how I particularly do it. I'm going to stop the share right there. And yeah, so hopefully this week will be a little easier as far as turning in that assignment, because all you have to do are those 3 things. And then make sure you review before you take the midterm. That's important. Read all those articles. They're pretty short. Well, the only one that's long, but I put as an optional, is the advanced kind of explanation, goes really deep into data visualization, why it's helpful. But there's also a simple short one. I think it just gives some really good ways of thinking about why it's so important. And there's some psychology behind there. So it's not just pictures are nice. If you want to actually manipulate or use the human brain to your benefit, you will always have pictures when you want to make a financial argument. They cannot be separated, or you can, but your chances of succeeding are lowered unless you use this.